At the core of who I am is el español de mi mami. At the core of who I am is my mother's Spanish. I was recently with one of my great friends. She's Puerto Rican, and she was on the phone with her son, and she turned to me and asked me to read off her credit card numbers to him because she was driving. And as I read them, I switched from Spanish to English without skipping a beat. And as he laughed on the other end of the line, he said, "You can read them to me in one language." And I responded, "No, Spanglish is the language of my people." At that time, I said that a bit tongue-in-cheek. But the more I think about that statement, the more I know it to be true. My ancestors were indigenous, and without much consent involved, Spaniards came and created a new raza, mestizos they called us. The inbreeding, so to speak, of Spanish and indigenous persons resulted in the majority of the population in Latin America. The language of mestizos is primarily Spanish. Erasure of our varied indigenous languages was real, and it cannot be reversed in most cases. With migration to the USA came an additional element, this additional language, English. A lot of us have had to learn English. We have had to learn English to thrive and to become successful members of society. And I realize this is a loaded term, and I'll not explore the various intentional words I use to refer to my migration and adaptation of your English, but what I'm trying to say is that learning English is almost non-optional to survive here. However, I'm going to need you to understand that Spanish is my first language, and language discrimination is real. I took 3 years of ESL. Once in the public school system, I learned English, although my parents never really learned it, so I still spoke Spanish at home until I left the bubble behind in my mid-20s. But Spanish is still my home language. It reminds me of tajadas con queso. Spanish reminds me of where I come from, but also I speak slang Spanish. That brings me to a specific neighborhood in Managua, Nicaragua, known as Chico Pelon. Spanish is the language of my mother and my father, and how they say my name makes me feel safe. Spanish is also the language of my original oppressors, and when I speak it, I'm reminded of my country's colonization all the time. Conversely, Spanish is the language of liberation because what our countries have individually done with the language is beautiful. Tell me you don't get goosebumps when you hear the beautiful words of a Dominican, or how a kid from Jinotega speaks it, or even how a Colombian speaks Spanish. We have taken this thing that was force-fed to so many of us, and we have transformed it into a beautiful expression of survival. When you learn to dream and think in both languages, when your migration has scripted 2 languages into your soul, you learn to feel safest with those of us who can speak both fluently. Those people get me. They understand what it means to translate complicated documents to their Spanish-speaking parents, abuelas, and tías. They understand that English only is reserved for those who never had to struggle to learn and unlearn the cultura out of you. Those of us who speak Spanglish fluently know that sometimes you will not know the name of something in one language or the other, which usually means that one side has exposed you to books while the other exposed you to love. I make declarations of love in Spanish because I learned to love in Spanish. And in English, I can fight with my words unlike anyone else because I had to learn to fight and protect me and mi raza in that language. But Spanglish is the language of my people. My people being a specific kind of immigrant or a kid of an immigrant who learned 2 languages fluently but also opted to not prioritize either one, because we're a product of 2 worlds. To not prioritize either colonizer language is important for me, and speaking Spanglish is political. I've often found myself in spaces where English-speaking people find my Spanglish threatening. I think it's because it makes them feel like outsiders. But imagine growing up as an outsider in the only country you can call home your entire life. Imagine growing up feeling like an outsider in your motherland and in this new land, and never feeling like you belong to either one. Now imagine feeling so isolated that you begin to make a home in your own mouth, And in that tongue, you carry resistance to both worlds. In that tongue, I carry Spanglish. And to discredit and reject my praxis of survival is to forget that I'm doing this for me. I do this for me and for those of us who have never felt like we belonged. Oftentimes, that feeling of not belonging is brought on by outsiders whose ancestors destroyed our connection to our indigenous roots a long time ago. Oftentimes, that feeling of not belonging is ill-placed because I think they forget that they are guests who overstayed their welcome in our side of the world. I do not ask permission to speak Spanglish because I do not ask permission to exist, and I cannot exist without full acknowledgement of these two worlds.